morning sun cast long shadows across the motor pool at Fort Harrison as Captain Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her dusty pickup truck. The sound of diesel engines roaring to life filled the air, accompanied by the sharp barks of drill sergeants and the metallic clanking of modern warfare machinery. But Sarah's eyes weren't on the sleek M1A2 Abrams tanks that dominated the training ground. Instead, her gaze fell upon a solitary machine sitting at the far corner of the lot, almost hidden behind a maintenance shed. It was an M60 Patton tank, its olive drab paint faded and weathered, bearing the scars of decades. To everyone else, it was a museum piece, a relic from a bygone era. To Sarah, it was home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had requested assignment to the M66 months ago, much to the bewilderment of her commanding officers and the outright mockery of her peers. Fresh out of the Armor Officer Basic Course at Fort Benning, she could have had her pick of the most advanced fighting vehicles in the Army's arsenal. Instead, she chose what most considered obsolete technology. The decision had followed her like a shadow throughout her tenure at Fort Harrison. Major Kevin Rothwell, the battalion's executive officer, never missed an opportunity to remind her of what he saw as a career-limiting choice. He was a man who measured success in technological advancement and modernization metrics, viewing tradition as nothing more than an obstacle to progress. Mitchell, he had said just last week during a briefing, his voice carrying that particular brand of condescension reserved for those he deemed beneath his intellectual capacity. I hope you realize that sentimentality has no place in modern warfare. That antique you're so fond of belongs in a museum, not on a battlefield. The other officers had chuckled at his comment, their laughter echoing through the briefing room. Captain Derek Hamilton, who commanded one of the newer Abrams, had been particularly vocal in his amusement. He was everything the Army seemed to value these days: young, aggressive, and completely enamored with cutting-edge technology. "Sarah's got herself a collector's item," Hamilton had quipped, his perfectly pressed uniform and gleaming insignia reflecting his status as the battalion's golden boy. "Maybe she can give historical tours between combat missions." But Sarah had remained silent, her jaw set in quiet determination. She knew something they didn't, something that would soon become crystal clear. The M60 Patton had been her grandfather's tank during the Vietnam War. Colonel James Mitchell had commanded the same type of machine through the jungles of Southeast Asia, where reliability and mechanical simplicity often meant the difference between life and death. He had taught Sarah that the newest wasn't always the best, that sometimes the old ways endured for good reason. "Technology fails, Sarah," he had told her during one of their many conversations before his passing 3 years earlier. "But a well-maintained machine with a crew that knows every bolt and rivet will never let you down when it matters most." Sarah's crew consisted of 3 soldiers who had been specifically requested to serve with her. Sergeant First Class Maria Gonzalez, her gunner, was a 20-year veteran who had cut her teeth on M60s before transitioning to more modern platforms. Her loader, Sergeant Tommy Chen, was young but possessed an almost supernatural ability to keep older equipment running. Her driver, Corporal Jake Morrison, came from a family of mechanics and could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. They called themselves the Old Guard, a name that started as an insult from other crews but had been embraced with pride. While other tank crews spent their time learning complex computer systems and digital interfaces, Sarah's team focused on mechanical excellence and tactical fundamentals. The morning routine was always the same. Sarah would arrive first, conducting her preliminary inspection while the base slowly came to life around her. She checked the track tension, examined the road wheels, and ran her hands along the armor plating, feeling for any signs of stress or damage. It was a ritual that connected her to generations of tank commanders who had performed the same intimate inspection of their machines. Gonzalez arrived next, her weathered face showing the kind of respect for the M60 that could only come from years of experience. She had served on these tanks during the tail end of their active service life and understood their capabilities better than anyone. "Morning, Captain," she said, her voice carrying the easy confidence of a soldier who had seen everything the Army had to offer. "How's our girl looking today?" Quote, "Solid as always, Maria," Sarah replied, patting the tank's hull affectionately. "Ready for whatever they throw at us." Chen and Morrison completed the crew, arriving with the kind of synchronized timing that spoke to months of working together. They moved around the tank with practiced efficiency, each knowing their role in the complex dance of pre-operation checks. The contrast between Sarah's crew and the others was stark and intentional. While modern tank crews relied heavily on automated systems and computer diagnostics, the old guard maintained their machine the old-fashioned way, with knowledge, experience, and an almost mystical understanding of mechanical systems. "You know," Morrison said as he checked the final drive, his Kentucky drawl adding warmth to the morning air, "the other crews don't understand what they're missing. All those computers and gadgets just give you more things that can break down." It was a philosophy that permeated everything they did. Sarah had drilled her crew relentlessly on manual procedures, backup systems, and improvised repairs. They could operate their tank even if every electronic system failed, a skill that seemed increasingly irrelevant in an age of digital warfare. The mockery from other units had only intensified over time. During training exercises, the sleek Abrams tanks would race past them, their crews making exaggerated gestures and comments about keeping up with the times. The M60's slower speed and older targeting systems made it an easy target for ridicule. But Sarah noticed things others missed. She saw how often the modern tanks required specialized maintenance, how frequently their complex systems went down for repairs, how dependent their crews had become on technology that could fail at the worst possible moment. The M60, by contrast, was like a reliable old truck. It might not be the fastest or the most sophisticated, but it started every morning, ran all day, and asked for nothing more than basic maintenance and fuel. Its mechanical systems were simple, robust, and repairable in the field with common tools. As the morning progressed and the base came fully alive, Sarah could see the familiar pattern of activity around the modern tanks. Technicians swarmed over the Abrams, running diagnostic tests and updating software. Specialist equipment was wheeled out to service complex systems that required factory-trained personnel to maintain. Meanwhile, Sarah's crew completed their preparations with nothing more than basic tools and decades of accumulated knowledge. They were self-sufficient in a way that modern tank crews had forgotten how to be. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. In an army that prided itself on technological superiority, she had chosen to place her faith in simplicity and reliability. It was a decision that would soon be tested in ways none of them could imagine. As she climbed into the commander's cupola and settled into the familiar worn seat, Sarah felt the weight of history around her. This tank had served faithfully for decades, had proven itself in combat, and had earned the respect of those who truly understood what warfare demanded. The engine rumbled to life with a sound that spoke of mechanical solidity and dependable power. It wasn't the whisper-quiet purr of a modern turbine engine, but the honest growl of a machine built to last. As they rolled out for morning training, Sarah couldn't help but smile at the knowing looks exchanged between her crew members. They were ready for whatever came next. The briefing room at Fort Harrison buzzed with an unusual energy that Tuesday morning in late September. Officers filed in with coffee cups and notepads, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned. Colonel Patricia Blackwood, the battalion commander, stood at the front of the room beside a large tactical display that remained covered by an olive-drab cloth. Sarah entered with her usual quiet confidence, taking a seat in the third row alongside other company commanders. She noticed the way conversations seemed to pause as she passed, the sideways glances that had become commonplace since her assignment to the M60. Major Rothwell sat in the front row, his posture rigid with the kind of anticipation that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Blackwood began, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation like a blade. "What I'm about to share with you does not leave this room until the official announcement." She pulled away the cloth, revealing a detailed map of the Mojave Desert training area known as the National Training Center. In 6 weeks, this battalion will participate in Operation Desert Crucible, a joint training exercise with our NATO allies. The scenario involves a rapid deployment to defend critical infrastructure against a simulated enemy force equipped with the latest Russian and Chinese military technology. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. The National Training Center was legendary among armor officers, a proving ground where careers were made or broken, where the Army's best units tested themselves against the most realistic combat scenarios possible. The exercise will last 2 weeks, Blackwood continued, clicking to the next slide. Phase 1 involves a 200-mile movement to contact across varied terrain. Phase 2 is a sustained defense of multiple objectives under continuous enemy pressure. Phase 3. She paused for effect. Phase 3 is a counterattack that will push the limits of both man and machine. Captain Hamilton leaned forward in his seat, his eyes gleaming with the prospect of showcasing his Abrams in such a high-profile environment. Several other officers began whispering excitedly about the opportunity to demonstrate their unit's capabilities on such a prestigious stage. However, Colonel Blackwood's voice took on a more serious tone. There's a complication. The exercise parameters include severe electronic warfare conditions. Enemy jamming will disrupt GPS navigation, digital communication systems, and computerized fire control. Additionally, maintenance support will be limited to simulate real-world deployment constraints. The excitement in the room dimmed considerably. Modern armored warfare relied heavily on digital systems, satellite navigation, computerized ballistics calculations, encrypted communications networks. The prospect of operating without these technological advantages was daunting for crews accustomed to their assistance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Major Rothwell stood up, his voice carrying its usual authoritative tone. Colonel, with respect, our M1A2 systems are designed to operate in electronic warfare environments. Our crews are trained on manual backup procedures. I'm sure they are, Major, Blackwood replied, her expression neutral, which is why this exercise will be particularly valuable. We'll discover just how well those backup procedures work under sustained combat stress. Quote, Sarah felt a familiar stirring in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced during her grandfather's stories about Vietnam, where simple mechanical systems often outlasted their more sophisticated counterparts. The M60 had no GPS to jam, no computerized fire control to disrupt, no digital communications to intercept. After the briefing, the officers clustered in small groups, discussing the implications of the exercise. Sarah overheard Captain Hamilton talking animatedly with several other Abrams commanders. It's just a matter of preparation, he was saying, his voice full of confidence. We'll run additional drills on manual systems. Besides, even without computers, an M1A2 is still the most powerful tank on the battlefield. Lieutenant Colonel Wayne Foster, the operations officer, approached Sarah as she reviewed her notes. He was one of the few senior officers who had never openly mocked her choice of equipment, though his expression now carried a mixture of concern and curiosity. Captain Mitchell, he said quietly, I hope you understand the visibility of this exercise. There will be observers from the Pentagon, foreign military attachés, and defense contractors. Every aspect of our performance will be scrutinized. Sarah nodded. Understood, sir. My crew and I are ready. Foster studied her for a moment. I'm sure you are. But I have to ask, are you certain about taking that M60 into such a high-stakes environment? No one would question a request to transition to a more modern platform before the exercise. It was the same question Sarah had been asking herself, though she'd never admit it. The rational part of her mind recognized the risks. If the M60 failed to perform, if her crew couldn't keep up with the modern units, it wouldn't just be her career on the line. It would validate every criticism, every mocking comment, every suggestion that tradition had no place in contemporary warfare. Sir, she replied, her voice steady, I believe my crew and our equipment will exceed expectations. Foster nodded slowly. I hope you're right, Captain. For all our sake. Over the following days, preparation for Operation Desert Crucible consumed the entire base. The modern tank crews threw themselves into intensive training on manual backup systems, practicing navigation by map and compass, and learning to operate their fire control systems without computer assistance. The complexity of these procedures became immediately apparent. Systems designed to be automated didn't translate easily to manual operation. Sarah watched from a distance as Abrams crews struggled with procedures that were second nature to her team. The sophisticated thermal imaging systems that gave modern tanks their edge in night fighting became nearly useless without their computerized enhancement. The advanced ballistics computers that automatically calculated range, wind, and target movement required extensive manual input when operating in backup mode. Meanwhile, the old guard maintained their regular training rhythm. The M60's manual systems required no adaptation. They had always operated without digital assistance. Gonzalez could calculate firing solutions in her head faster than most crews could input data into their computers. Morrison navigated by terrain features and compass bearings with an accuracy that impressed even veteran instructors. But the pressure was mounting from unexpected directions. Word of the upcoming exercise had spread beyond the base, reaching the attention of military journalists and defense industry representatives who saw an opportunity to showcase American armor capabilities. The presence of an M60 in such a high-profile exercise was generating curiosity and, in some quarters, concern about the image it might project. General Raymond Hayes, the division commander, paid an unscheduled visit to Fort Harrison 3 weeks before the exercise. He was a career armor officer who had commanded M1A1 tanks during the Gulf War and understood both the capabilities and limitations of modern armored systems. Sarah was conducting maintenance checks when she noticed the parade of staff cars arriving at the motor pool. General Hayes, accompanied by Colonel Blackwood and several other senior officers, walked directly to her position. "Captain Mitchell," the general said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command experience. "I understand you'll be taking this machine to the National Training Center." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, coming to attention beside her tank. Hayes walked slowly around the M60, his experienced eye taking in details that others might miss. He noted the meticulous maintenance, the careful attention to mechanical systems, the way Sarah's crew moved with quiet efficiency around their machine. "Tell me, Captain," he said finally, "what makes you confident that this tank can perform effectively against modern simulated threats?" It was the question Sarah had been preparing for since the day she'd requested assignment to the M60. Her answer would either validate her choice or provide ammunition for those who questioned it. "Sir," she began, her voice clear and confident, "this tank has 3 advantages that no amount of technology can replicate. First, mechanical reliability. Every system can be maintained and repaired in the field with basic tools. Second, crew proficiency. My soldiers know every component intimately because they can't rely on computers to compensate for their mistakes. Third, tactical flexibility. We're not dependent on external systems that can be jammed, hacked, or disrupted." General Hayes listened intently, his expression revealing nothing. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, studying both Sarah and her crew. "Captain," he said finally, "I hope you're right, because in 6 weeks, the whole world will be watching." The weeks leading up to Operation Desert Crucible transformed Fort Harrison into a hive of frantic activity. Supply convoys rolled in daily, delivering specialized equipment and spare parts for the high-tech armored vehicles. Maintenance bays worked around the clock as technicians fine-tuned computerized systems and updated software packages. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation and anxiety. But nowhere was the tension more palpable than in the officers' club on Friday evening, 2 weeks before deployment. The monthly social gathering had taken on an unusual edge as conversations inevitably turned to the upcoming exercise. Sarah sat at a corner table with Lieutenant Amanda Rodriguez from the logistics company, trying to enjoy a quiet dinner while the volume of surrounding discussions steadily increased. At the bar, Captain Hamilton held court with several other Abrams commanders, his voice carrying clearly across the room. He had been drinking just enough to loosen his tongue without completely abandoning military courtesy, a dangerous combination that often led to regrettable statements. "I'm telling you," Hamilton declared, gesturing expansively with his beer bottle, "the whole thing is going to be a disaster. We're supposed to represent American armor superiority, and we're showing up with equipment that belongs in a museum." Quote. Captain Lisa Brennan, another Abrams commander, nodded in agreement. "It's embarrassing, honestly. What are the NATO observers going to think when they see us rolling up in a tank that was obsolete when their grandfathers were born?" The conversation was clearly intended to be overheard. Sarah continued eating her meal, her expression remaining neutral despite the growing knot in her stomach. Lieutenant Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her loyalty to Sarah conflicting with her recognition of the social dynamics at play. Major Rothwell emerged from a private dining room where he had been meeting with several visiting Pentagon officials. His timing seemed calculated as he approached the bar group, his presence lending official weight to their complaints. "Gentlemen, ladies," he said, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone who had just been briefing senior leadership. I've just finished discussing the exercise parameters with some very interested parties from Washington. The level of scrutiny we'll be under cannot be overstated. Hamilton seized the opening. Sir, with respect, shouldn't we be fielding our most capable equipment? This exercise is about demonstrating American military excellence, not conducting a historical reenactment. A chorus of agreement rose from the assembled officers. The sentiment was spreading beyond the armor community. Even officers from other branches were beginning to question the wisdom of including an M60 in such a visible demonstration. I mean, what's next? Captain Brennan added, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Are we going to bring muskets to represent our infantry heritage? The laughter that followed was cruel and pointed. Sarah felt every eye in the room turn toward her table, the weight of their collective judgment pressing down like a physical force. She set down her fork and looked directly at the group, her pale green eyes holding steady despite the hostile attention. Is there something you'd like to say directly, Captain Brennan? Sarah asked, her voice calm but carrying enough steel to cut through the ambient noise. The room fell silent. Brennan's face flushed, caught between her desire to continue the attack and her reluctance to engage in open confrontation with another officer. Major Rothwell stepped into the breach, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of a mediator while his words carried their own sharp edge. Captain Mitchell, I think everyone here shares the same concern. We're all professionals who want this exercise to succeed. Some of us question whether personal sentiment should override tactical considerations. It was expertly done, framing the criticism as professional concern while implying that Sarah's decision was based on emotion rather than military judgment. The suggestion that she was putting personal feelings ahead of mission success was particularly damaging in a culture that prized objective analysis above all else. Sarah stood slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled. The simple action somehow commanded more attention than any raised voice could have achieved. When she spoke, her words were measured and precise. Major, with respect, my decision to command an M60 is based on tactical analysis, not sentiment. While you've been focusing on maintaining computer systems, my crew and I have been preparing for the realities of combat, where technology fails and mechanical reliability becomes paramount. That's a nice theory, Captain, Hamilton interjected, emboldened by the crowd's support. But theory doesn't win battles. Firepower wins battles. Advanced targeting systems win battles. Armor protection wins battles. Your grandfather's tank might have been effective in 1970, but this is 2024. The mention of her grandfather was a step too far, a personal attack disguised as professional critique. Sarah felt anger flare in her chest, but her training and discipline held it in check. Instead of responding with emotion, she delivered a response that would haunt Hamilton for weeks to come. You're absolutely right, Captain. Firepower, targeting, and protection do win battles, which is why I'm confident that when your computerized systems fail in the Mojave, and they will fail, my crew will still be fighting effectively while yours is trying to reboot. The challenge was unmistakable. Sarah had just publicly predicted that the modern tanks would suffer system failures during the exercise, a bold statement that would either prove prescient or career-ending. Major Rothwell's face darkened. That's quite an accusation, Captain. Are you suggesting that our equipment is unreliable? I'm not suggesting anything, sir. I'm stating a fact based on maintenance records and exercise reports. Complex systems fail more frequently than simple ones, especially under adverse conditions. That's not opinion. That's engineering reality. Quote. The truth of her statement was uncomfortable because it was backed by data that everyone in the room knew but preferred not to discuss. Modern tanks required exponentially more maintenance hours per operational hour than their predecessors. Their computer systems were vulnerable to both enemy action and environmental factors that had never affected purely mechanical systems. But acknowledging these realities would undermine the narrative of technological superiority that defined contemporary military culture. Sarah had committed the cardinal sin of speaking an uncomfortable truth in public. The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Blackwood, who had been attending the same Pentagon briefing as Major Rothwell. Her entrance changed the dynamic immediately, as officers straightened and conversations became more guarded. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important, she said, her tone suggesting that she had heard enough to understand the situation. Just discussing exercise preparations, ma'am, Major Rothwell replied smoothly. Captain Mitchell was sharing her perspectives on equipment reliability. Colonel Blackwood's gaze moved deliberately around the room, taking in the faces of her officers and the obvious tension in the air. She was a seasoned commander who had navigated similar situations before, understanding that unit cohesion was as important as tactical proficiency. "Captain Mitchell," she said finally, "I trust your crew is ready for the challenges ahead." "Yes, ma'am. We're prepared for whatever the exercise demands." "Good. Because I have some additional information about those demands." Blackwood's expression grew serious. "The Pentagon observers won't just be evaluating our tactical performance. They'll be assessing the viability of different equipment platforms under next-generation warfare conditions. The results will influence procurement decisions for the next decade." The implications hit the room like a physical blow. This wasn't just about training or unit pride. It was about the future direction of American armored warfare. The performance of every tank in the exercise would be scrutinized not just for tactical effectiveness, but for lessons about technology, reliability, and combat sustainability. Captain Hamilton's face went pale as he realized the magnitude of what he had been saying. If his Abrams suffered the kind of system failures that Sarah had predicted, it wouldn't just be embarrassing. It could influence billion-dollar defense contracts and strategic military planning. Furthermore, Colonel Blackwood continued, there will be embedded journalists documenting the exercise for a Defense Department publication about modernization and adaptation. Every aspect of our performance will be preserved for historical analysis. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had requested an assignment to the M60 because she believed in its capabilities, but she had never imagined that her choice would become a test case for fundamental questions about military technology and doctrine. As the gathering dispersed, the mockery that had seemed so confident moments before took on a different character. The officers who had been laughing at the antique tank now faced the possibility that their modern equipment might be the one they found wanting. But the damage to relationships had been done. Sarah walked back to her quarters alone, the weight of expectation and hostility settling on her shoulders like armor. In 2 weeks, she would either vindicate her faith in proven technology or provide her critics with the ultimate validation of their skepticism. The stakes had just become higher than anyone had imagined. The departure for the National Training Center was scheduled for 0500 hours on a crisp Monday morning in late October. Fort Harrison had transformed into a massive logistics operation as 37 tanks, support vehicles, and supply trucks prepared for the convoy to California. The motor pool hummed with activity as crews performed final inspections and loaded equipment that would sustain them for 2 weeks in the Mojave Desert. Sarah arrived at 0330 earlier than required but unable to sleep. The weight of the past weeks pressed on her shoulders as she approached her tank in the pre-dawn darkness. Floodlights cast harsh shadows across the motor pool, creating an almost surreal atmosphere that seemed appropriate for what lay ahead. Sergeant First Class Gonzalez was already there, methodically checking ammunition storage and communication equipment. Her weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, each action deliberate and purposeful. She looked up as Sarah approached, her expression carrying the calm confidence of a veteran who had seen enough combat to understand what truly mattered. "Couldn't sleep either, Captain?" Gonzalez asked, her voice carrying a hint of maternal concern that she rarely displayed in front of the younger soldiers. "Too much to think about," Sarah admitted, running her hand along the M60's turret. The steel was cold under her palm but somehow reassuring in its solidity. Sergeant Chen and Corporal Morrison arrived within minutes of each other, their synchronization speaking to months of working as a tight unit. Chen carried a thermos of coffee and a stack of technical manuals, while Morrison had his toolkit and a small bag of spare parts that weren't officially required but might prove invaluable in the field. "Final systems check," Morrison asked, already moving toward the engine compartment with the familiarity of a surgeon approaching an operating table. The crew worked in comfortable silence, each member focusing on their area of expertise while remaining aware of the other's activities. It was a ritual they had performed countless times, but today carried additional weight. Every component they checked, every system they tested, would be scrutinized under the most demanding conditions imaginable. At 0430, the other tank crews began arriving. The contrast in preparation methods was immediately apparent. The Abrams crews wheeled out diagnostic computers, connected data cables, and began running automated systems checks. Their tanks' engines started with the whisper-quiet efficiency of modern turbines, digital displays illuminating cockpits that resembled aircraft more than traditional armored vehicles. Captain Hamilton's crew was particularly thorough. spending extra time on their computerized fire control system and GPS navigation equipment. Hamilton himself moved with the nervous energy of someone who knew he was being watched, his earlier confidence replaced by the sobering reality of what lay ahead. Major Rothwell made his rounds through the motor pool, clipboard in hand, checking off items from his preparation checklist. When he reached Sarah's position, he paused longer than at the other tanks, his expression unreadable in the harsh artificial light. "Everything in order, Captain?" he asked, his tone neutral but carrying undertones of skepticism. "Ready for deployment, sir," Sarah replied crisply. "All systems checked and verified." Rothwell glanced at the M60, taking in its deliberately analog appearance amidst the high-tech environment. "I hope you understand the responsibility you're carrying, Mitchell. This exercise will be studied for years to come." Before Sarah could respond, Colonel Blackwood's voice echoed across the motor pool through the public address system. "All personnel prepare for the final briefing in the assembly area. Departure in 30 minutes." The briefing was conducted under the stars, with 37 tank commanders and their senior crew members arranged in neat rows before a portable projection screen. Colonel Blackwood stood silhouetted against the display, her presence commanding attention despite the early hour. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "in 6 hours we will arrive at the National Training Center. From that moment until we return to Fort Harrison, everything we do will be evaluated, recorded, and analyzed. You represent not just this battalion, but the entire United States Army Armor Branch." The slides that followed outlined the exercise scenario in greater detail than had been previously revealed. The enemy force would be equipped with the most advanced electronic warfare capabilities available, designed to replicate threats from near-peer adversaries. Communications would be jammed across multiple frequency ranges. GPS signals would be spoofed or blocked entirely. Even hardened military networks would face sophisticated cyber attacks. Phase 1 begins immediately upon arrival, Blackwood continued. A 200-mile movement to contact across varied terrain, ending with establishment of defensive positions at Objective Alpha. Navigation will be by map and compass only. Communication will be limited to short-range radio using frequency-hopping protocols. Sarah felt a surge of confidence as she absorbed the parameters. Everything described favored the M60's mechanical systems and her crew's traditional skills. While other units would be adapting to unfamiliar limitations, the Old Guard would be operating in their element. Phase 2 will test your ability to maintain defensive positions under sustained attack for 72 hours. Resupply will be limited and contested. Equipment failures must be repaired in place with available resources. The emphasis on field repairs and resource limitations was music to Sarah's ears. Morrison's mechanical expertise and Chen's improvisational skills would shine under such conditions, while crews dependent on specialized technicians and factory parts would struggle. Phase 3 requires a coordinated counterattack across 40 miles of open desert. Speed, reliability, and tactical flexibility will determine success or failure. As the briefing concluded, Sarah noticed several Abrams commanders exchanging worried glances. The exercise parameters seemed designed to challenge exactly the capabilities they had spent years developing: technological integration, digital coordination, and system automation. The convoy formation placed Sarah's M60 near the rear, a positioning that wasn't accidental. Major Rothwell wanted the antique out of sight during the highly visible departure, minimizing its prominence in the carefully choreographed display of American armor. But as the tanks rolled out of Fort Harrison in the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah felt a different kind of anticipation than her colleagues. While they worried about system compatibility and electronic resilience, she looked forward to proving that sometimes the old ways were the best ways. The journey to California would take 18 hours, with scheduled stops for fuel and maintenance. It was during the first fuel stop in Kansas that the initial signs of trouble appeared. Captain Brennan's Abrams developed a fault in its computerized fuel management system, requiring a 2-hour delay while technicians traced the problem through multiple circuit boards and software modules. The fix required replacing a component that cost more than most civilian automobiles. Meanwhile, Sarah's crew completed their refueling in 20 minutes using manual procedures that hadn't changed since the tank was first manufactured. Morrison checked fluid levels by sight and touch, methods that were as reliable as they were simple. Computers, Gonzalez muttered as they watched the technicians work on Brennan's tank. "Give me mechanical gauges any day." The delay was minor, but it established a pattern that would become increasingly significant as the convoy progressed westward. Complex systems began showing stress from the long journey, requiring attention from specialists who weren't always immediately available. By the time they reached the National Training Center, 3 Abrams had experienced minor malfunctions that would have been non-issues for simpler machines. Sarah's M60, meanwhile, had run flawlessly for 1,800 miles, requiring nothing more than routine checks and basic maintenance. As they passed through the gates of the training center, Sarah could see the elaborate observation posts and monitoring stations that would track their every movement. The exercise hadn't officially begun, but the evaluation had already started. General Hayes was waiting at the staging area, along with a delegation of observers whose uniforms represented military forces from around the world. The sight was both inspiring and intimidating, a reminder that American military doctrine would be judged by how these tanks performed over the next 2 weeks. "Welcome to the Crucible," Colonel Blackwood announced over the radio as the convoy ground to a halt. "From this moment forward, we are in a combat environment. Everything we do matters." Sarah felt the familiar calm that always descended on her before important events. Her grandfather had taught her that confidence came from preparation, and preparation meant understanding your equipment so thoroughly that it became an extension of yourself. The M60 sat quietly among its more sophisticated cousins, its analog simplicity, a stark contrast to the digital complexity surrounding it. In a few hours, the exercise would begin, and all the theoretical arguments would give way to practical reality. The time for preparation was over. The time for proof had arrived. The Mojave Desert stretched endlessly in all directions as Operation Desert Crucible commenced at 0600 hours sharp. The morning air was crisp and thin, carrying the promise of temperatures that would soar past 110 degrees by midday. 37 tanks spread across the starting line, their crews making final adjustments before beginning the 200-mile movement to contact that would serve as the exercise's opening phase. Sarah stood in her commander's cupola, studying the terrain ahead through old-fashioned binoculars while her fellow commanders relied on digital maps and GPS coordinates. The irony wasn't lost on her. Within the hour, those electronic aids would become useless, leaving many crews navigating by instruments they had rarely used outside of basic training. "All stations, this is Sabre 6, Colonel Blackwood's voice crackled over the radio. "Exercise begins now. Navigation aids are compromised. Switch to manual procedures and maintain radio discipline." Almost immediately, the effects of the electronic warfare simulation became apparent. Digital displays flickered and died across the modern tanks as GPS jammers came online. Computerized navigation systems that had guided these vehicles for thousands of miles suddenly showed error messages or blank screens. Captain Hamilton's voice came over the radio, tension evident despite his attempt to sound controlled. "Sabre 6, Steel 2-1 is experiencing navigation system failures. Requesting technical support." "Negative, Steel 2-1, came the reply. "Exercise parameters prohibit external technical assistance. Resolve using available resources." Sarah watched through her binoculars as Hamilton's crew scrambled to deploy paper maps and compass equipment they hadn't used in months. The sophisticated inertial navigation system that normally tracked their position to within meters was now a useless collection of silent electronics. Meanwhile, Morrison had already oriented their map using terrain features and compass bearings, a skill he had practiced until it became second nature. "Bearing 270 degrees to the first checkpoint, Captain," he reported calmly. "Estimated travel time 45 minutes at standard pace." The M60 pulled away from the starting line with mechanical confidence, its diesel engine settling into the steady rhythm that would carry them across the desert. Behind them, several Abrams crews were still struggling with their backup navigation procedures, their usual technological advantages now liabilities. 3 hours into the movement, the first major crisis struck. Captain Brennan's tank, the same one that had experienced fuel system problems during the convoy, began showing warning lights on its remaining functional displays. The sophisticated computer that managed engine performance and transmission settings had detected anomalies that its programming couldn't resolve. "Sabre 6, Steel 3-4 has multiple system alerts," Brennan reported, her voice tight with frustration, requesting permission to halt for diagnostics. "Steel 3-4, state the nature of your alerts." The engine management computer is showing fault codes. Transmission control is in limp mode. Computer diagnostics are non-functional due to electronic warfare conditions. Sarah could see Brennan's tank in the distance, moving at reduced speed with visible exhaust smoke that suggested engine problems. The irony was painful. The sophisticated systems designed to optimize performance had become so complex that they couldn't be diagnosed or repaired without the very computer networks that the exercise had disabled. "Looks like their smart tank isn't so smart anymore," Chen observed quietly from his loader's position. "Focus on our job," Sarah replied, though she couldn't help feeling a grim satisfaction at seeing her predictions beginning to come true. By noon, the temperature had risen to over 105 degrees, and the stress on both men and machines was becoming evident. The Abrams tanks, with their turbine engines and sophisticated cooling systems, were consuming fuel at rates that exceeded their planned logistics. Several crews reported overheating warnings on systems that normally managed themselves automatically. Morrison, meanwhile, was monitoring the M60's engine temperature using mechanical gauges that had proven reliable for decades. The diesel engine ran hot but steady, its simpler cooling system maintaining stable temperatures without computer intervention. "Temperatures holding steady at 190, he reported. Fuel consumption tracking exactly as planned. The difference in fuel efficiency was becoming a critical factor. While the Abrams tanks carried more fuel, their turbine engines consumed it at nearly twice the rate of the M60's diesel, especially under the stress of manual operation and desert heat. Captain Hamilton's crew was struggling with more than just navigation. Their thermal imaging system, designed to provide superior target detection capabilities, required constant computer adjustment to account for changing atmospheric conditions. Without automated compensation, the system produced images that were difficult to interpret and often misleading. Gonzalez, observing the same terrain through the M60's optical sight, had no such problems. "Target reference point visible at 2 o'clock, she reported, identifying a landmark that thermal imaging was failing to distinguish clearly. The first day's movement revealed a pattern that would define the entire exercise. Modern tanks that relied heavily on computer assistance found themselves handicapped by the very sophistication that normally gave them advantages. Crews accustomed to automated systems struggled with manual procedures that required skills they had rarely practiced. The M60, by contrast, operated exactly as it had been designed 50 years earlier. Every system functioned manually, every procedure had been practiced countless times, and every crew member understood their equipment at a fundamental level that computer-dependent operators had never achieved. As evening approached, the first day's casualties began to mount. 2 Abrams had suffered mechanical failures that required them to be towed to maintenance areas. One crew had become lost when their backup navigation failed, requiring radio guidance to reach the objective. Another tank had experienced cooling system problems that left it operating at reduced capability. Sarah's M60 reached Objective Alpha on schedule, its crew alert and its systems functioning normally. They had covered 180 miles across some of the most challenging terrain in North America, without a single mechanical problem or navigation error. Colonel Blackwood's command post was a study in controlled chaos as reports flowed in from across the exercise area. The electronic warfare conditions that were supposed to test adaptability had instead revealed fundamental weaknesses in how modern armor crews operated. "Sir," Major Rothwell reported to the colonel, his voice carrying a note of concern that hadn't been present at the start of the exercise, "we have 7 tanks experiencing significant technical difficulties. Maintenance teams are reporting that most problems require diagnostic equipment that isn't functional under current electronic conditions." Blackwood studied the situation map, noting the positions of tanks that had reached their objectives versus those still struggling across the desert. One position marker stood out. The M60 had not only reached its assigned location, but had done so ahead of schedule and without any reported problems. "What's the status of Mitchell's tank?" she asked. "Fully operational, ma'am. Her crew reported no significant issues during the movement phase." The observation posts scattered across the exercise area had been tracking every vehicle with sophisticated monitoring equipment. The data they were collecting painted a picture that challenged fundamental assumptions about modern armored warfare. General Hayes stood in the primary observation bunker, studying real-time feeds from multiple cameras and sensors. Foreign military observers flanked him, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned as they watched American armor struggling with conditions that simulated real-world electronic warfare. General, one of the British observers commented quietly, "Your older platform seems remarkably unaffected by the electronic countermeasures." Hayes nodded grimly. He was beginning to understand that this exercise might reveal truths that would be uncomfortable for proponents of technological solutions to tactical problems. As darkness fell on the first day of Operation Desert Crucible, the scorecard was becoming clear. Modern tanks with sophisticated systems were experiencing failure rates that exceeded all projections, while the supposedly obsolete M60 continued functioning exactly as intended. The embedded journalists were taking note as well. Their reports would eventually reach Pentagon decision-makers and defense contractors who had invested billions in the computerized systems that were proving vulnerable under realistic combat conditions. Sarah's crew settled into their defensive position as night fell, rotating watch duties with the disciplined efficiency of soldiers who understood their equipment and trusted each other completely. Around them, other crews worked frantically to restore failed systems or adapt to capabilities they had lost. The first day had been a revelation, but it was only the beginning. Phase 2 would test sustained operations under pressure, and Phase 3 would demand tactical flexibility that might prove impossible for crews struggling with degraded systems. The desert wind carried the sound of engines working harder than they should, of crews learning hard lessons about the difference between training and reality. Sarah listened to these sounds and felt a quiet confidence that her grandfather would have recognized. The crucible was just beginning to heat up. Dawn broke over Objective Alpha with the harsh clarity that only the desert could provide. The second day of Operation Desert Crucible would test the battalion's ability to maintain defensive positions under sustained simulated attack, and the night had already begun to take its toll on equipment and morale. Sarah emerged from her tank's hull where she had managed 3 hours of fitful sleep, her body stiff from the cramped quarters but her mind sharp with the anticipation of what lay ahead. The defensive perimeter stretched across 2 miles of rocky terrain, with tank positions carefully concealed among the natural features that dotted the landscape. The contrast between her position and those of the modern tanks was immediately apparent. While Abrams' crews worked frantically to restore systems that had failed overnight, the M60 sat ready for action with the quiet confidence of a machine that had operated the same way for decades. Corporal Morrison emerged from beneath the tank's hull, wiping grease from his hands with practiced satisfaction. "Completed the night maintenance check, Captain. Everything's running like a Swiss watch." Gonzalez was already at her position in the turret, methodically checking the main gun's manual systems and confirming ammunition counts. Her movements carried the easy competence of someone who had performed these tasks so many times they had become muscle memory. "Visibility's good this morning," she reported, scanning the horizon through her optical sight. "No thermal distortion yet, but it'll heat up fast once the sun gets higher." The mention of thermal conditions highlighted another advantage the M60 enjoyed. While the Abrams' sophisticated thermal imaging systems struggled with manual calibration and computer-assisted interpretation, Gonzalez's optical sight performed identically regardless of electronic interference or atmospheric conditions. Across the perimeter, the sounds of technical difficulties were becoming a constant background noise. Generators hummed as crews attempted to power diagnostic equipment that might restore failed systems. Radio chatter filled the airwaves with requests for technical support that couldn't be provided under exercise conditions. Captain Hamilton's voice cut through the morning air with barely controlled frustration. "Sabre 6, Steel 2-1 requesting guidance on fire control system restoration. Our manual backup procedures aren't matching the technical manual specifications." Colonel Blackwood's response carried the weight of a commander watching her carefully planned exercise reveal uncomfortable truths. "Steel 2-1, exercise parameters prohibit external technical assistance. Your crew must resolve the issue using available resources and training." The silence that followed spoke volumes about the gap between theoretical training on backup procedures and the practical reality of implementing them under stress. Hamilton's crew had spent hundreds of hours learning to operate their tank's sophisticated computerized fire control system, but only a fraction of that time practicing the manual procedures they now desperately needed. Sarah listened to the exchange while conducting her own checks of the M60's fire control system. The irony was profound. Her supposedly obsolete equipment required no restoration because it had never relied on the computerized systems that were failing throughout the battalion. Range card updated, Gonzalez reported, having completed her manual calculation of distances to key terrain features. The process took longer than computer-assisted ranging, but it was also immune to electronic interference and required no external power source. As the morning progressed, the scale of the technical difficulties became increasingly apparent. Major Rothwell's situation reports painted a picture of a modern armored unit struggling to adapt to conditions that would have been routine for tank crews of previous generations. "Colonel, we have 12 tanks reporting significant system degradation," he briefed over the command network. "Fire control computers are offline on 7 platforms. Navigation systems are non-functional on 15. Communications are intermittent across the entire formation." The statistics were sobering. Nearly a third of the battalion's tanks were operating with severely limited capabilities, while others struggled with degraded performance that reduced their tactical effectiveness. Supply requirements were exceeding projections as crews consumed extra fuel and spare parts attempting to maintain operations. General Hayes observed the unfolding situation from his command bunker, surrounded by monitoring equipment that tracked every aspect of the exercise in real time. The data being collected would influence military procurement decisions for years to come, and the trends were deeply troubling for advocates of high-technology solutions. General, his aide reported quietly, "The foreign observers are requesting additional briefings on American maintenance doctrine. They're expressing concern about operational readiness under contested electronic environments." It was a diplomatic way of saying that America's allies were beginning to question whether the U.S. military's reliance on sophisticated technology might be a critical vulnerability in future conflicts. The implications extended far beyond a single training exercise. At 1,000 hours, Phase 2 officially began with simulated enemy artillery strikes targeting the defensive positions. The scenarios were designed to test each crew's ability to maintain effective fire while under pressure, coordinate with adjacent units, and adapt to changing tactical situations. Sarah's crew responded to the first simulated bombardment with practiced efficiency. Morrison executed evasive maneuvers that positioned the tank behind natural cover while maintaining fields of fire. Gonzalez acquired targets using optical sights that functioned perfectly regardless of the electronic chaos surrounding them. Chen loaded ammunition with mechanical precision that didn't depend on automated systems. The M60's main gun spoke with the authority of 105 mm high explosive rounds, each shot calculated using manual procedures that had proven effective across decades of combat. The target engagement was smooth, coordinated, and devastatingly accurate. Other crews struggled with the same tactical requirements. Captain Brennan's tank, still suffering from computer malfunctions, fired 3 rounds before achieving a hit that would have been automatic with functioning fire control systems. The time delays and ammunition waste would have been catastrophic in actual combat. By midday, the desert heat had risen to 115 degrees, adding environmental stress to the already overwhelming technical challenges. The Abrams tank's air conditioning systems, dependent on properly functioning computers to regulate themselves, began failing under the combination of electronic interference and thermal load. Crews accustomed to climate-controlled fighting compartments found themselves operating in furnace-like conditions that affected both human performance and equipment reliability. Heat-sensitive electronic components began shutting down to prevent damage, further degrading already compromised systems. The M60, designed in an era when air conditioning was a luxury rather than a necessity, continued operating normally. Its crew had trained extensively in desert conditions, understanding that environmental adaptation was as important as technical proficiency. "Temperature inside is holding at 95 degrees, Morrison reported. Not comfortable, but well within operational parameters." The difference in crew endurance was becoming a significant factor. While other teams rotated personnel to prevent heat exhaustion, Sarah's crew maintained their positions and effectiveness throughout the afternoon. Their conditioning and equipment allowed sustained operations that were proving impossible for other units. At 1,400 hours, the exercise introduced its most challenging element yet: a coordinated, simulated air attack that required rapid movement, camouflage, and air defense coordination. The scenario tested whether crews could maintain tactical effectiveness while managing multiple system failures and environmental stresses. The response revealed the exercise's most sobering lesson yet: Modern tanks dependent on computerized coordination systems struggled to communicate with air defense units, failed to execute coordinated maneuvers, and presented easier targets due to their inability to manage emissions that normally would be controlled automatically. Sarah's crew executed a textbook response to air attack. Morrison moved the tank to a prepared camouflage position using terrain masking techniques that didn't require electronic coordination. Gonzalez maintained air watch through optical systems while continuing to monitor ground targets. Chen prepared appropriate ammunition loads for both air and ground threats. The M60's mechanical simplicity allowed it to go silent in ways that electronic systems couldn't match. With engines idling and all non-essential systems shut down, it presented minimal electromagnetic signature while remaining ready for immediate action. Colonel Blackwood watched the exercise unfold from her command post, her expression growing more concerned as reports continued to arrive. What had been planned as a demonstration of American armor capabilities was becoming a case study in technological vulnerability. "Ma'am," her operations officer reported, "we're seeing effectiveness ratings that are significantly below projected parameters. The electronic warfare conditions are having impacts we didn't anticipate." The understatement was profound. American military doctrine had evolved around the assumption that technological superiority would provide decisive advantages in any conflict. The exercise was demonstrating that those same technologies could become liabilities when facing sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities. International observers were taking detailed notes on every aspect of the unfolding situation. Their reports would reach defense ministries around the world, potentially influencing alliance relationships and military procurement decisions for years to come. As afternoon turned toward evening, supply convoys attempted to reach the defensive positions with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts needed to sustain operations. The convoys faced their own navigation challenges in the electronically contested environment, with several vehicles becoming lost or delayed. When supplies finally reached the forward positions, the distribution revealed another troubling pattern. Modern tanks were consuming fuel, spare parts, and maintenance hours at rates that far exceeded peacetime projections. The sophisticated systems that promised enhanced capability were proving to require intensive support structures that might not be available in actual combat. The M60 required minimal resupply beyond basic fuel and ammunition. Its mechanical systems operated within design parameters. Its crew remained effective despite environmental stresses, and its maintenance requirements could be met with tools and parts that were readily available. Sarah stood outside her tank as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, watching supply crews struggle to service the complex needs of modern armored vehicles. The scene reminded her of her grandfather's stories about Vietnam, where mechanical reliability often mattered more than technological sophistication. "Captain," Gonzalez said quietly, joining her outside the tank, "the other crews are starting to look at us differently." It was true. The mockery and dismissive comments that had characterized the past weeks were being replaced by something that looked suspiciously like respect. Crews that had ridiculed the antique tank were beginning to understand that their own sophisticated machines were proving less capable under adverse conditions. But the exercise was far from over. Phase 3 would begin the following morning, requiring a coordinated counterattack across 40 miles of open desert. The mission would test mobility, coordination, and sustained combat capability under the most demanding conditions yet. As darkness fell across Objective Alpha, Sarah's crew settled into their night routine with the confidence of soldiers whose equipment and training had been validated under fire. Around them, other crews worked through the night attempting to restore failed systems and prepare for challenges that promised to be even more demanding than what they had already faced. The desert wind carried the sounds of generators, frustrated voices, and mechanical problems that couldn't be solved with software updates or system reboots. In the distance, the lights of the command post flickered as officers struggled to understand how modern military technology had become such a liability in realistic combat conditions. Tomorrow would bring the final test, and Sarah felt a quiet confidence that her grandfather would have recognized. Sometimes the old ways weren't just different, they were better. The final dawn of Operation Desert Crucible broke with an ominous red sky that seemed to forecast the intensity of what lay ahead. Phase 3 would test everything the battalion had learned over the past week, a coordinated counterattack across 40 miles of hostile terrain that would push both man and machine to their absolute limits. Sarah stood atop her tank in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the silhouettes of other armored vehicles as their crews made final preparations. The contrast with the confident departure from Fort Harrison was stark. Many tanks showed visible signs of wear from the grueling exercise, with jury-rigged repairs and makeshift solutions holding critical systems together. The M60, however, looked exactly as it had 7 days earlier. Its mechanical systems had operated flawlessly throughout the exercise, requiring only routine maintenance that Morrison had performed with tools any mechanic would recognize. There were no computer codes to clear, no software to reinstall, no specialized technicians required. Colonel Blackwood's voice crackled over the radio at exactly 0530 hours. "All stations, this is Sabre 6. Phase 3 commences in 30 minutes. Execute movement to assault positions." The counterattack plan required precise coordination between multiple tank companies, artillery support, and air cover, all while maintaining communications in the heavily jammed electronic environment that had plagued the entire exercise. For modern tanks dependent on digital coordination systems, it represented the ultimate challenge. As the formation began moving, the accumulated stress of the past week became immediately apparent. Captain Hamilton's tank, patched together with bypassed systems and jury-rigged repairs, managed only half its normal speed. His crew had worked through the night attempting to restore fire control capabilities, but the complex computer interfaces remained unpredictable. Sabre 6, Steel 2-1 is experiencing intermittent fire control failures, Hamilton reported, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had characterized his earlier communications. "Request permission to operate in backup mode." "Negative, Steel 2-1. Exercise parameters require full engagement simulation." The response was devastating in its implications. Hamilton's sophisticated Abrams, with its advanced armor and powerful main gun, was essentially disabled by computer failures that reduced it to a mobile bunker rather than an effective fighting vehicle. Similar reports flooded the command network as the battalion attempted to execute its most complex mission yet. Tanks that had started the exercise as examples of American technological superiority were now struggling to perform basic functions that should have been routine. Sarah's M60 moved through the desert with mechanical precision, its crew operating with the smooth coordination that came from weeks of training on systems that never changed, never required updates, and never failed mysteriously. Morrison navigated by terrain features and compass bearings with an accuracy that impressed even veteran instructors monitoring the exercise. "Bearing adjusted to 285 degrees, he reported calmly. "Target area in sight, estimated range 4,000 meters." Gonzalez had already acquired the simulated enemy position through her optical sight, calculating range and wind compensation using methods that had proven effective across decades of combat. "Target identified, range 4,100 meters, ready to engage." The engagement that followed was a masterclass in traditional gunnery. The M60's 105mm gun spoke with authority, placing rounds precisely on target while the tank maintained movement toward its objective. Each shot was calculated manually, aimed optically, and fired mechanically, a process that required no computers, no software, and no electronic systems that could be jammed or disrupted. Around them, other tanks struggled with the same tactical requirements. Captain Brennan's crew, still fighting computer malfunctions, required multiple attempts to achieve hits that should have been routine. The delays and ammunition waste would have been catastrophic in actual combat, where first-shot accuracy often determined survival. As the counterattack progressed, the exercise's most sobering lesson became undeniable. The sophisticated systems that promised enhanced capability had become liabilities that reduced, rather than improved, combat effectiveness under realistic conditions. General Hayes watched the final phase unfold from his observation post, surrounded by monitoring equipment that tracked every aspect of the engagement. The data being collected painted a picture that would revolutionize thinking about military technology and tactical doctrine. "Sir," his aide reported quietly, "Mitchell's tank has achieved a 96% target engagement success rate while maintaining movement speed and formation discipline. That's the highest performance rating in the entire battalion." The irony was profound. The antique tank that had been mocked and dismissed was now demonstrating superior combat effectiveness to the most advanced armored vehicles in the American arsenal. By midday, the counterattack had achieved its tactical objectives, but the cost in terms of lessons learned was enormous. More than half the battalion's modern tanks had experienced significant malfunctions that reduced their combat capability. Supply requirements had exceeded all projections as crews consumed extra fuel, ammunition, and spare parts attempting to maintain operations. The M60, meanwhile, had operated exactly as designed throughout the entire exercise. Its fuel consumption matched peacetime projections, its maintenance requirements were minimal, and its crew remained effective despite environmental stresses that had degraded other units. As the exercise concluded, Colonel Blackwood called for an immediate after-action review. The assembled tank commanders presented a sobering picture of technological systems pushed beyond their operational limits by conditions that simulated realistic electronic warfare environments. "The lessons from this exercise are clear," Blackwood began, her voice carrying the weight of someone whose assumptions about modern warfare had been fundamentally challenged. "We have become overly dependent on systems that may not be available when we need them most." Major Rothwell, his earlier confidence replaced by obvious concern, presented statistics that would influence military procurement for years to come. Average system availability across M1A2 platforms was 67% during Phase 3. Fuel consumption exceeded projections by 34%. Maintenance requirements were triple normal rates. The contrast with the M60's performance was stark and undeniable. Sarah's tank had maintained 100% system availability throughout the exercise, while consuming resources at exactly projected rates. General Hayes arrived for the final debrief accompanied by the international observers who had monitored every aspect of the exercise. Their expressions ranged from thoughtful to deeply concerned as they absorbed the implications of what they had witnessed. "Captain Mitchell," the general said, his voice carrying a respect that hadn't been present 2 weeks earlier, "your performance during this exercise has been exceptional. More importantly, it has demonstrated principles that we may have forgotten in our pursuit of technological solutions." Sarah stood at attention, but her response reflected the confidence that had sustained her through weeks of mockery and doubt. "Sir, this exercise proved that reliability and crew proficiency often matter more than sophistication. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways." The statement resonated through the briefing room like a physical force. Officers who had dismissed her choice as sentiment now faced the uncomfortable reality that their technological assumptions had been proven wrong under the most demanding conditions possible. Captain Hamilton approached Sarah after the formal debrief, his expression mixing embarrassment with genuine respect. "I owe you an apology, Sarah. I thought you were living in the past, but it turns out you were preparing for the future." The transformation in attitudes was remarkable, but hardly surprising. The exercise had demonstrated that complexity could be a liability, that automation could become a weakness, and that traditional skills might be more valuable than anyone had imagined. 3 months later, Sarah received orders that would have seemed impossible before Operation Desert Crucible. She was assigned to lead a special program developing hybrid doctrine that combined traditional mechanical systems with carefully selected modern technologies. Her M60 became the prototype for a new generation of armored vehicles designed for reliability rather than sophistication. The lessons of Desert Crucible spread throughout the military, influencing everything from procurement decisions to training doctrine. The exercise that was supposed to showcase American technological superiority had instead revealed the importance of fundamental military virtues that predated the computer age. Sarah's grandfather would have understood the outcome perfectly. In his letters from Vietnam, he had written that the best weapons were those that worked when everything else failed, operated by soldiers who understood their equipment so thoroughly that it became an extension of themselves. The antique tank that had been mocked and dismissed had proven those words true once again. Sometimes the future looked remarkably like the past, and sometimes that was exactly what victory required. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.